Welcome, good afternoon to this seminar organized by the Expert Group for Aid Studies, entitled Swedish Aid to Afghanistan, What Are the Lessons Learned? My name is Johan Schar. I'm the Vice Chair of the Expert Group for Aid Studies. Many of you will know what EBA, the expert group, is, but just a few words to characterize us. We are a government committee which is tasked to review and analyze and evaluate Swedish aid, particularly Swedish International Development Corporation, with the purpose of providing evidence and analysis for the continued improvement and heightening of the quality of Swedish aid. The work we do is characterized by what we call dual independence, and this means that we, as a committee, independently decide on what studies or evaluations to undertake, on the one hand. On the other hand, the authors who produce reports or evaluations for us are independent in their work. So the conclusions that they provide are those of the author and not of the EBA. And of course, by doing these kinds of studies and producing these documents, we try to build bridges between research, policy, and practitioners. And we do that by not only through written publications, but also through seminars like this one and a podcast that we produce. So today we are very pleased to launch a new working paper which is entitled Punching Above Its Weight or Running with the Crowd. Lessons from Sweden's Development Cooperation with Afghanistan 2002 to 2020. And of course it will escape no one how timely this report is. We do not have a crystal ball. We could not have foreseen what has happened over the past few weeks. And of course today, the 31st of August, US troops, this was the deadline for the complete withdrawal of US presence in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is facing a very uncertain future, and all actors, Swedish government, SIDA, and all others who have been engaged in Afghanistan over the past years will now be busy analyzing, trying to understand what has happened, what was the process, and what role have we played, we who have engaged in during these 20 years of engagement. And we hope through this report to contribute to the Swedish and international analysis and review of what has happened and what can be done as we look ahead. Just a few practical details before I introduce Adam Payne. We are live streaming this event at YouTube. If you want to promote this in social media, please tag it EBA committee. We will invite questions towards the end of the seminar, and please use the chat box on your Zoom screen to ask your questions. Use the chat box. So I think that's what I need to say to introduce the webinar. Please, Adam. Welcome. Adam Payne is uniquely positioned and placed to do this kind of analysis. He has worked for some 20 years on Afghanistan in different kinds of capacities, but basically doing research, analysis, evaluations during this time. He joined the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit during its foundation in 2001. And he has led research programs on rural livelihoods under conditions of insecurity and the rural economy, not only in Afghanistan. He also has a link to Sweden in that he is a part-time researcher at the Department of Urban and Rural Development at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala. Please, Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Johan. Good afternoon. I will explain my title, by and by, as we work through, I understand that the sort of the English, this English metaphor of punching above its weight needs some explanation. It doesn't exactly translate into Swedish. Quick background. I've worked actually in 3 mountain states in the Himalayas over the last 30 years, in Bhutan, Nepal and Afghanistan. When I'd asked the question 30 years ago which state, or 40 years ago which state might make it, one might have given Afghanistan a higher chance compared to the others. As it is Bhutan that has been the most successful of the building states. It started as an absolute monarchy. 30 or 40 years later, it is a democracy. The means by which it has done it have not been the orthodox means of state building. It was through inspired leadership, commitment, and it reflected a buy-in and legitimacy from its population. It's a useful lesson to bear in mind, because at the heart of this issue of Afghanistan is, can you, and if so, how, build states? As Johan mentioned, the outcome and timing of this report is fortuitous. It was written in a different mode of thinking in terms of continuing as things are. That does not mean, and indeed I will come to that at the end, and I'm sure some of the discussion will focus on it, that the lessons from history are not relevant to the future. In fact, I would argue they are particularly relevant to the future, and they should be borne in mind. And I think the 3 questions that I would raise, that in a sense I come back to answer. What might Sweden learn from engagement in this multilateral reconstruction effort? What might Sweden learn from its programming engagement in Afghanistan? And what does this mean for the future in terms of whether, if so, and how it might engage with the government that is coming into power, potentially the Taliban? I will, in my comments, broadly structure it around the structure of the report to summarize the key points, looking at the aid landscape in Afghanistan, Sweden's country strategies, CEDA's program content, what it did, the lessons that we might learn, and then a reflection on a core argument of the report that by and large the programming has not taken sufficient account of the way that Afghanistan actually works. And I call it questioning policy dogmas. Core lessons that emerge from it, and then some considerations about next steps. The aid landscape, and by this I mean the totality of all that has been poured into Afghanistan, needs to be recognized in terms of understanding the room for maneuver that Sweden has had. What has dominated financial flows in Afghanistan has been military spending. The CIGAR, the US agency, recently estimated that nearly $1 trillion had been spent by the US in Afghanistan. 86% of this had been on military spending, another nearly 9% to the Afghan security forces, 1% to drug interdiction, 1.5% to US agencies, with just under 2% to development activities. Put Sweden's contribution to Afghanistan in perspective, and in total it's amounted to 1 to 2.6% of all development funding. Development funding has been a very small component of the overall investment, and Sweden's role in that has been relatively small. Therefore, the opportunities for Sweden to sort of play at a table where there are heavyweights, as it were, have been severely constrained by the dominance of the military agenda. The ways of funding, often funding off budget, not going through government, and the level of funding, particularly from the military flows of spending, contributed to the construction of a state that was more dependent on external revenues, much more dependent than internal revenues. So the financial flows have been a major, had major negative consequences on the ability of the state, Afghan state, to consolidate itself. There's also been an extremely crowded field of donors with no natural lead in any sector. The Ministry of Education has had to work with 23 donors at various stages, who have often worked to different models and understandings of exactly what appropriate education policy would be. There's also been provincial selection. Some donors work in some provinces, often related to where they had military investments. Sweden was not immune from that mistake, if I may call it like that. And there have also been competitive policy models, the extreme case of which was in counter-narcotics, anti-opium, where you had not only conflict between the major players in counter-narcotics, the US and the UK, but you had conflict between the different agencies within the US government, such that there were cross-alignments between the US and UK against their own other agencies in department. It has been an extremely challenging aid landscape. And to expect that Sweden would be able to negotiate it and, in a sense, punch above its weight is certainly demanding a lot of Sweden. But there's an observation that the UK House of Lords Committee made in commenting on the UK and its investment in Afghanistan. And it said this: the UK's interests in Afghanistan are not unique and distinct. They are bound up with those of its allies, led by the US. The UK has had limited opportunities and has shown little inclination to exert an independent voice, and along with other NATO allies, and has followed the US lead. This is regrettable. And that comes back to the point of punching above that weight. To what extent has Sweden taken an independent position and challenged some of the orthodoxy in relation to the reconstruction effort? And as one informant that I talked to said, his feeling was that Sweden had by and large run with the herd, rather than leveraging a distinctive and principled position as it has done so in the past. Sweden has had a long engagement in Afghanistan, and that needs to be recognised. And it's been a consistent engagement, which could hardly be said of many other donors in Afghanistan, who abandoned it after the Russians left. And that goes back particularly to the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan. Since 2001, there have been 6 country strategies, and the latest was released in April 2021. These strategies, as they're called by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would say are basically statements of principle and their aspirational hopes for what Afghanistan would come. And if one was being really critical, one might say they're more visions of how Afghanistan should become more like Sweden in terms of the outcomes. They've been ambitious and they've expanded in their ambition, but it's not clear that they've actually been influenced by lessons learned in programming, both of Sweden's own program and the trajectory of change that Afghanistan has gone through in the last 20 years. Afghanistan has often simply been described in terms of what it hasn't got, or of the high levels of poverty, or lack of rights for women, which somehow these deficits must be reduced, and Afghanistan should become like Sweden, democratic, accountable, prosperous, healthy. Swedish funding is interesting. About or up to 50% has gone to multilateral agencies, reflecting Sweden's principled position in relation to multilateral engagement. Some to the UN and some to the Afghanistan Trust Fund, the ARTF. About 25% have gone to the Swedish Committee of Afghanistan, and that is unprecedented. There is no other country that has supported a country NGO to that extent for so long, and I want to come back to that. And about another 25% have gone direct support to other civil societies and NGOs. This briefly presents a list of some of the evaluations, probably most of the evaluations have been carried out on Sweden's programme, illustrating the diversity of their programme in relation to multilateral support, UNICEF, for example, United Nations Democratic Programme, ARTF, evaluations for the Swedish Committee of Afghanistan, and also its support to civil society and NGO support, including organisations like the Afghan Analyst Network, a key source of understanding and information about Afghanistan, the Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit I worked with, and others. These, in a sense, have been part of the source material that has been drawn on in this report. Now, interventions, programs, projects, call it what you like, are usually built on assumptions. Why are we doing this? What do we think will result of it? And how do we account for what we do? How do we explain how what we do will lead to the outcomes we're after? These are sometimes called theories of change. Now, some problems are easy to address. Building roads, for example, or building a school. That's what we call a bounded problem. No one would disagree that if you don't have a road and you need a road, people need to travel, that building a road helps. But many of the interventions that have been part of programming, both by Sweden and others, are what we call unbounded problems. For example, capacity building. And there's been a lot of capacity building program. Afghans need to have their capacity built. Capacity to do what? It depends how you define what the problem actually is. And many of the programs that Sweden has done have had a combination of both the, in a sense, instrumental, building a road, but then building onto it a mix of other sort of activities with even greater ambitions, such as developing markets, empowering women. These mix of ambitions, the relatively short time and means, had often meant that much of these ambitions in terms of capacity change or market development have simply not come about. You can assess programs in terms of the International Development Advisory Committee criteria, and CEDA also has been interested in poverty, gender and conflict sensitivity. There are 5 of these, but the one I really want to focus on is the issue of relevance. In a sense, it's a gatekeeper or foundational criteria in evaluating programs, because it asks the question, is this really relevant? The lesson that one draws from seeing evaluations, that relevance is usually defined in terms of need. And if you characterize Afghanistan as a country of deficits, poverty, lack of rights, then of course the needs are boundless, and therefore the programs are justified in their own right. But if you ask the question, are these programs actually relevant to context, to how things actually work, then that demands a much more critical assessment. And that assessment has very rarely been made. So there are the dangers, as Seaguy have recently put it, of doing the wrong thing perfectly, investing your efforts in something which you might achieve but simply are not relevant to the problem on the ground. There are the modalities of engagement. And if you look at the evaluations, the best that can be said of the multilateral support, particularly to UN agencies, is they've been somewhat lackluster, except when they've been instrumental in the building of roads. Support to ARTF has been there. There has been some preferencing, but by and large, that has not been a characteristic most recently. There has been support to the Swedish Committee of Afghanistan, which has done its work primarily in education, in health and disability. And there have been significant effects, and they've been effective. And I will come back to why that might be the case. There have been other programs which actually have not been evaluated, and which I found out, in a sense, through other secondary material, such as the support to the Mary Stopes International. And they show a way of working by CEDA, which is based much more on trust and trusting relationships, as it works with the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, in allowing organizations to pursue their engagement in the ways that make sense at the context, at the ground level. And these have been much more effective. So there are some very clear strengths in CEDA's programming over the last 20 years. The point that I would make is I'm not sure they have been sufficiently recognized and built on in terms of learning of how to do things in the wider programming. So summing up so far, and in a sense, the more general lesson is there, as it was made by another evaluation, in the sense these findings about Sweden are not unique. The international community has repeatedly overestimated its own capacity to bring about rapid social change. What has worked best are locally embedded projects with immediate tangible benefits. What has really worked are projects aimed at building capacity and changing behavior. That is why investments in basic health and education work. Interventions in such sectors as the rule of law or gender really have worked. And Sweden is not immune from that criticism in its programming. Why is this? Why have these programs, why have there been so many programs that have invested so much money not delivered on what they wanted? Part of the problem has been the very framing, what I call substantialist agenda, focusing on outcomes, with simplistic cause-effect assumptions linking an intervention to results, expecting quick change. And a lot of the reason for that is the stories that have been told about Afghanistan, which justify these policy models have been implemented. I call them imaginaries, ideas in our mind. This is what Afghanistan is, this is what we must do, therefore we do it. But they've all been based on a very limited understanding of how Afghanistan actually works, or how interventions actually engage with the logic of existing practice. And there has been insufficient learning from the ways these projects do work and what that tells you. So there's this paradox, if you like, of Swedish aid. On the one hand, there are some very good elements to it, and there are lessons to be learned from that. On the other, it has sort of run with the herd and done what everyone else has done, but it has delivered rather few results from that. If I were to tell a story about what Afghanistan is, taking context into account, I would tell a rather different story. History did not start in 2001, assuming there was a blank slate, nothing there. Nor did it even start in 1978. The whole process of state formation has been long and conflictual. There has long been a gulf between the urban elite and the rural population, and that remains today. The urban is still deeply mistrusted by the rural, who still constitute a major part of the population. Regional identities have persisted, but above all, the interference by external actors, the funding they have given to the Afghanistan state has made Afghanistan rentier, dependent on external income. It has never generated sufficient income from taxation or within the country to build any sort of social compact or contract with its citizen. 1978-2001 led to enormous structural changes in terms of the incentives, the structure of markets, the politicization and of ethnic identities and so forth. 2001 was not a peace settlement. Indeed, the Americans specifically blocked the possibilities for that to take place with the Taliban. It was a division of the spoils. And key warlords who had been in opposition to the Taliban were brought in. And they have played a major role in undermining the credibility on fueling corruption and so forth. But external aid and an incoherent reconstruction agenda has contributed to that. As The Economist recently put it, in pursuit of a utopian ideal to eradicate terrorism, America sought to produce an unprecedented Afghanistan state and was fighting an unwinnable war. And that is the position that we have now reached. As Paddy described it, what we did to Afghanistan over the last 20 years was to create a precarious sovereignty in office, but not in power. The key source of revenue, the key decisions actually taken elsewhere. 2021, which is where we are now, is not 1996. 60% of the population is now under 25, with very little experience of the Taliban. There is certainly popular sentiment for elections and peace and for a republican state. And therefore, what the Taliban face now is very different from what they faced in 1996. And, as I will come back to at the end, the Taliban now are not what they were in 1996 either. One of my major critiques, in a sense, of the Sweden and of other aid programs is the ways in which core policy dogmas have driven programming. Assumptions about how agriculture will drive transformation, how we must introduce markets, how we must build capacity and build a state contract, how we must build rights and gender equality. I don't have time here to explore my critique of why these core policy dogmas do not address and understand and speak to the specific context of Afghanistan. I will just take one example, or two examples. Firstly, most Afghans live under conditions of fear, of insecurity. And much of that effort goes to obtaining freedom from threats and the hazards of living in a violent place. They obtain that security from the family and the village, the key institutions that hold the structure of Afghanistan together. They are not independent. They are not autonomous actors. And in programme, we need to understand much more the processes by which people can move from freedom from fear to freedom to act, where they can act in independent autonomous security. As the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan programming shows, that is a slow and incremental process. It's done by degree where women inside households gain greater room for manoeuvre, gain more respect, so that they can begin to engage with the outside world. And that outside world also needs to change gradually, step by step. So, what are the core lessons? What might Sweden learn from engagement in the multilateral reconstruction effort? I think it needs to invest in punching above its weight. It needs to think, what is it? I mean, Sweden has been a principal donor. I would acknowledge that. But it's not thought hard enough about what could we do that actually could leverage greater benefit. It's got to invest much more in learning. And indeed, one of my major comments would be the lack of learning from programs. And it needs to be more adventurous in its programming and selective in its multilateral partners. I would also suggest there needs to be a much greater actually engagement in strategy, thinking about not only where we would like Afghanistan to be, but understanding of where it is now, what the obstacles might be, and how they might be addressed to processes of change. What might Sweden learn from its programmatic engagement in Afghanistan? Certainly reduce the use of recipient organisations such as UNDP as simply instruments to determine achieving predetermined changes. It needs to invest much more in open, long-term relationships with recipient organisations that share the principles and the social change agenda at the heart of SIDA's commitment, as use these as a basis for learning. And I was interested to see that a Dutch review of the programme into crisis states came very much to the same conclusion. We've got to think differently. We've got to work slowly. We have to build trusting relationships with our partners and let them find the best ways in which to do things. And it means working much more with incremental change and move through what we would call second best institutions. The rights of women in Afghanistan not being immediately equivalent to those in Sweden, but a little better from where they are now as a stepping stone to improvement in the future. And what about the next steps? Engaging with the Taliban. And I want to make, in making my comments, I want to make two things very clear. I do not condone the Taliban. They are violent, they have been violent, and they may well continue to be violent. I also have close friends and colleagues who I worry for immediately in Kabul. But the Taliban now is not what it was in 1996. It has a well-established culture of negotiation. It's involved in pragmatic dealing. How else did Taliban come to power in the way that they have done over this last year? It was a process of strategic, political and military thinking that as they incrementally took place, they moved much more from an insurgency, military operation to one which was much more concerned with achieving legitimacy, engagement and the provision of basic services. They have forged alliances, they've bargained with citizens, and the ability to bargain has been absolutely essential to their ability to expand and maintain territorial control. As Ashley Jackson in her recent and very important book says, they can be fierce and ruthless, but they have a capacity to compromise. When Taliban ideology conflicts with the group's ability to achieve their objectives, it is the ideology, not the objectives, that ends up shifting. They may be a state-building project in the making. We may not like it, but we must recognize it for what it is. In the interest of millions of Afghans who will not leave the country, SIDA has to continue to engage. It must find a way to maintain sufficient funding for the provisioning of basic public goods. And it must focus on job creation as the key issue in addressing poverty and food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm sure there are many who would like to actually get a good look of this report. You can find it at the website of the Expert Group for AIDS Studies, EBA. So Adam, let's join our two panelists and walk over to the corner here. Before introducing them, I would like to ask Adam perhaps a difficult but sort of general overriding question which has to do with, I think, everything that you have presented here. Why is it you have shown that there have been repeated analyses, evaluations, reviews that have told us that this is not going the way we had hoped it would, repeatedly over the years, and still this very large aid effort has continued, and Sweden has continued also year after year, and you've stated that the Swedish development strategies have been quite similar as they have been presented over the years. Why do you think that this big engagement has continued despite these signs?
I think there are two comments I'd make to that. Firstly, a sort of herd mentality. We're all in this together, and no one has been willing, in a sense, to fail the narrative of Afghanistan. A lack of courage, if you like, to say this is not working. I would also say that people have invested too much in it. But the fact has become patently clear. There has been very little strategic thinking going on in terms of Afghanistan. How could people be so surprised by what happened in Kabul a week ago? It's quite clear there was no plan B or plan C, and I doubt if there was even a plan A. It should not have caught people by surprise.
Thank you. And I think this is a question that will be reflected on in all government offices across the world, in all the countries that have engaged over these past few years. So let me introduce our two panelists. First, we have Sara Ulveng-Flygare, who represents SIDA here. She works as a development analyst at the Afghanistan unit at SIDA. She has a background in economic history and has worked with she has experience from Africa, but she's worked with the Afghanistan unit since 2017. So you've seen all this unfolding over the past few years. And we also have Andreas Stefansson, who is the Secretary General of the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan since May 2017. You seem to coincide in your current positions. And you have worked for the Swedish Committee, as it's called often by Afghans. You worked for the Swedish Committee before that, already during the 90s in the field, and have had postings in the field in Afghanistan. So we are very pleased to have you as two key individuals as we reflect and try to learn from what Adam has presented. And I'd like to ask Sara to give us your comments, your reflections to what we have heard.
Thank you. And first I would like to thank to Adam for this very interesting report, and also to IBA for organizing the seminar and allowing us the opportunity to come here. We are living through quite extraordinary times, and it's both inevitable, I think, and deeply necessary to reflect on both the failures and the accomplishments of the international support to Afghanistan. It is evident and perhaps unavoidable that a lot of the public debate focus on where things have gone wrong. We have noted in the Swedish debate a slight tendency towards hindsight and a little bit of finger pointing, and I think blame gaming is, however, not going to be very beneficial to a learning process that we are all in now, I think. If you would ask me sort of what is some of the, for me, one of the most sort of striking lessons learned from these years is that it is extremely difficult to work and to sort of work with development assistance effectively in a country that is in a constant state of armed conflict, when you, as a donor, become so closely associated with one of the warring parties. It has also been very difficult to support state building towards a state that is so heavily reliant on a foreign military mission. That's been, to say it's been complicated, that would be a gross understatement, I think. There should be a focus on what could have been done better. There is a strong argument, I think, that could be made that as a whole, the international intervention, and then I'm talking about the military and the civil intervention, has had severe negative effects on Afghan society. I think we must recognize that. And I don't want in any way to diminish the problem that the international intervention has brought on Afghanistan. However, some important progress have still been made, and in recognizing this, and this is sensitive, I know, but we would also have to admit that without the military intervention in 2001, the Taliban of that time would still have been in power. Examples of progress made in Afghanistan span over several different areas of society. Expanded access to health, education, infrastructure has seen rapid improvements in outcomes. The position of women has improved, including through improved access to education, representation within civil service and politics. And against many indicators, Afghanistan is actually now performing similarly to other countries at their level of incomes, and while receiving similar levels of civilian aid, or were, one might definitely add, prior to the Taliban takeover, of course. Since 2002, Afghanistan has actually seen very strong growth in revenues, government revenues, through the establishment of a fairly effective revenue system, I would argue. And unlike many other low-income countries, this has been driven through a taxation of a dispersed economic activity, rather than what we have seen in other countries, a taxation of natural resource projects only. So these are not trivial accomplishments, I would argue, especially given that they have taken place in a country that has been in a constant state of armed conflict. They have been made possible by a combination, I would argue, of international support, but also by dedicated work of Afghan civil servants and NGO workers. And I fully agree with Adam's observation that history did not start in 2001, and having my own academic background in economic history, I totally agree with the point that he makes about the need to really understand historic processes of state formation. But I mean, absolutely, the point taken. But, and however, in 2001, Afghanistan was in shambles. It was not a functioning state at least in the traditional sense of the word. It was not able to deliver basic civil services to its citizens. And I would dare say that this state of things was a combination of consequences, both of the ineptness of the Taliban regime at that time to govern, but it was also due to the country's isolation. I think this backdrop is important to understand in order also to understand the political decision to support state building in Afghanistan, which has received some fair amount of criticism, I would argue. It's also important in the Swedish context to understand that there has been an overwhelming political support in Sweden for this approach to channel funds to the Afghan state. This was manifested in a government bill in 2012, and it was also supported by a majority of the political opposition at that time. To put it very simply, the Swedish policy was that the assistance to Afghanistan should be of high volume, it should be long-term, this engagement went up to 2024, and it should also strive to provide at least 50% of development assistance on budget. And throughout this time period, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which Adam mentioned in his presentation, administered by the World Bank, has been actually sort of only realistic vehicle to support to channel fund through the Afghan state due to substantial administrative requirements that were put on this funding. And Adam correctly points to, and I mean, I think we can all recognize this, that the level of funding and the many different donors that were present in Afghanistan was not at all only a salvation for this budding Afghan state. It also became a heavy burden to bear in terms of time spent on donor coordination and to coordinate different development efforts. And the ARTF came about as a response, an effort to coordinate support to the Afghan government and also to strengthen government ownership and reduce the amount of time spent on donor coordination. It can be argued to what extent that was fully achieved, but that was sort of the objectives. And there is in the report sort of a suggestion that SIDA as a donor should engage more with locally embedded organizations. And it might be good to nuance the sort of the picture that is presented on the ARTF here, just to comment that through support from the ARTF, for example, an organization such as the Swedish Committee has been able to increase their support of basic health services. In fact, 72 million Swedish kronor was transferred from the Ministry of Public Health in Afghanistan to Swedish Committee last year for this purpose. And I think we can all agree that these services are now sort of under severe threat when there is no longer any coordinated channel to handle these volumes of funding that we're talking about here. I think it comes as no surprise to most of us who's worked on Afghanistan, and I would argue that this doesn't go only for Afghanistan, that it's been easier to achieve objectives which have been bounded, if we use the language of the report, easy, well-defined and concrete. There are perhaps other ways of putting it. It's so much easier to build roads and schools compared to build capacity. So why engage in this capacity building, one might ask. It's quite difficult to achieve, and it's also tricky to measure. I think we who have worked on evaluation know that. But there is a problem here, and that is that if you build these roads, but you don't at the same time make sure that there is some kind of capacity for the government to generate revenues and also technical capacity to maintain upkeep, the road won't be there for very long after financing has ended. And I think that's an important case in point. Forwarding funds to weak state comes with substantial risk of corruption and misuse of funds. And there are surely important lessons learned on how this could have been done in a more thoughtful way, still unfolding, I may say. But seen in a longer perspective and then having this sustainability in mind, which I was just referring to, I would still argue that the political choice made to channel funds through the Afghan public institutions with the aim of supporting them to manage their own development resources was a correct one. A functioning state is needed to guarantee the delivery of basic services, building parallel structures for basic service delivery, and we saw this when the Taliban were in power the last time. For such basic service delivery of health and education, that will, through NGOs or the UN system or whatever, will mean a never-ending dependence of foreign assistance. And I think we can all recognize that all the achievements that I have sort of accounted for here, they are now under severe risk. And in all the tragedy that is constantly unfolding around us now, we receive reports through our partners of brave civil servants and NGO workers continuing to come to office to try at least to deliver some services, not being paid, I might add. And I believe that this report really presents some good food for thought when it comes to the approaches on development assistance and the necessity of supporting incremental change, and also be satisfied with good enough level of achievements is perhaps especially sobering and also quite inspirational, I think. Finally, I would like to touch upon this and relevance, and I find that particularly interesting. I think it's a valuable lesson. That the relevance of projects have been how they have been defined, and I think it was really due time that relevance criteria of evaluation was expanded and become more nuanced. In retrospect, it may seem self-evident that you shouldn't really sort of define the relevance of a project based on the assessment of need. But I think if you look at where the development aid business, if you like, come from, it's not such strange. It's sort of been ingrained in our organizational mandate to respond to needs and deficiencies, and then sort of in this perception that Afghanistan is a place of endless needs, that then all aid projects become sort of relevant. I totally think that it's really about time that's changed, and with this new sort of take on relevance, I think both evaluations but also aid, the projects in themselves will actually be much improved. I really believe that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sara, and thanks for taking such a broad approach and also identify, because I think Adam does account for a number of very important achievements during these years. not least the fact that we see much improved maternal and child health. We see great achievements in terms of expanding education, of course, not least for girls. And I think one fundamental question that we all will be asking now, what will be sustained? I mean, I think never has sustainability had such a concrete meaning as it does now. What will be sustained of these achievements? And let me follow up by asking you about gender equality, which of course is and has been throughout these 20 years a high priority for Swedish aid. And in terms of achievements that have been made, what do you don't have a crystal ball either, but what do you think, what's your reflection on these achievements in terms of improved conditions for women and girls?
I mean, the sustainability issue, I think we all recognize that this is at the core here. I think we are all, all development cooperation is struggling with the same question, but how do we I think we have to recognize that sustainability is really an issue here. A lot of funding has been channeled through vehicles that we don't any longer have in our predisposition, so to speak. So I think it's we need to work around this sustainability issue, but I don't think I have any clear answer as today of how that will be done. That's also ultimately a political decision, actually.
Thank you. Let's move on to Andreas Stefansson. Again, you are referenced, or the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan is referenced extensively in Adam's analysis. One might even dare calling it a little bit of a success story in the midst of this very complex and partly quite sort of depressing or negative reality. What have been your takeaways? What are your comments on what you have read and heard?
Yeah, well, to start with, I mean, it's flattering, but I don't think we should take the credit for all the positive changes in Afghanistan. And as you rightly pointed out, tremendous progress in many areas, actually. We shouldn't, I mean, the whole notion that the state is a told failed experiment, I think we should be cautious about such conclusions, because so much of the change that has happened over the 20 years has been on these vehicles of the public institutions. I would even argue that social change has also partially come about through the state institutions, because attitudes to education today, we have certainly contributed in rural areas by showing examples that it actually works, desensitizing conservative communities to the idea of girls getting educated and so on. But the scale, the massive scale of state institutions and making people used to the fact that girls actually get educated, they get jobs, they start to work as doctors, as midwives, and they start to appear in TV, they're decision makers. That whole process has also come about through the state building process. And that's not something that will disappear overnight. And that's something actually that the Taliban now have to relate to. So the actual fact that the Taliban now are moderating their stance might be even an effect of the society having changed due to state building. Nevertheless, let me get to your report, Adam. And first of all, thank you for inviting and organizing this EBA. Adam, a very interesting read and insightful, and with your emphasis on the contextual, I feel very much at home, being an old fan of Robert Chambers and, you know, handing over the stick and putting the last first and all that. Or as we say within SCA, putting the communities in the driving seat, target groups owning and articulating their own change agenda, driving it. So with your emphasis on understanding context, relevance and all that, that's very much at home with how we discuss things within SCA. So that kind of anthropological, for and perhaps lack of a better word, approach is I think very useful. And your study also helps us actually to better understand ourselves, SCA. I do think so. It will definitely be useful to share with my colleagues and discuss what we think about it. I think you pinpoint very important challenges and lessons learned and learnings from the state building experiment. And particularly when it comes to then social change, although I have just said things that perhaps would contradict what I just said now. I think it's the rapidness in social change that it's very important that you also pinpoint that you know this is this is you know something very incremental is the way you have to approach social change, and that comes about through the embeddedness that you've been talking about, things that happen from within, that you circle in your study. And you rightly point out how the military agenda, the US-led reconstruction efforts of war making and state making, has been actually detrimental to development in Afghanistan. It's undermined civilian efforts, and not the least the buy-in from local communities. I have 4 questions. This substantialist agenda of having, you know, results, outcomes, rights, equality, key policy words, aspirations, I think you call them, perhaps a bit of a blueprint approach, versus relationalist. I think you put us quite much in that bag, yeah? Of inclusive processes, context, iterative, from below, embeddedness, and so on. And then you quote Andrews, because I felt that this was a bit too much of a you know, exclusive divide, and then you quote Andrews' study from 2015 saying these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think if we try to learn what has happened in Afghanistan, we have to see that these two have sometimes contributed to each other, or you know, been mutually reinforcing each other. And there's this, to understand the relationist view, then there's this statement, or the quote, flow of contingent, contextual and complex dynamics of social change. Now, in that flow, I think, and now I'm coming to where we discuss things within SCA. In that flow of contextual and complex dynamics, we have to be careful not to just say, let's go with the flow. Because once you step into communities, you have power dynamics. And even though we try to be as embedded as possible, we should not forget that there is also a social change agenda there. And in SCA, we sometimes talk about, you know, to change tradition, you have to walk with tradition. But we are also cautious not to just sit down and drink tea with tradition. And we're also cautious not to run far ahead of tradition. But to walk with tradition and participate in changing tradition, you have to start to unpack also local communities and ask yourselves, where are the disempowered? And how do you strengthen them in their change agenda so they can actually start to internalize and drive change from within? And then you can extrapolate that wider and wider in Afghan society, and then you're up to the state level, perhaps. So that's one reflection. I would like you to just, you know, elaborate on that. And I'm not necessarily saying that you're saying, let's just go with the flow. The second one is on, so maybe it's a bit more philosophical question. Second one is on Sweden's strategies. I found that interesting that you found it, you know, puzzling how they're called strategies, but still they lack, you know, paths, priorities, sequencing, and so on. But from our point of view, because you also pinpoint that, you know, there's a lot of kind of trust relationship, we get quite a lot of leeway, or, you know, and so on. I think in terms of our identities and models, SCA, Mary Stopes, and so on, actually it gives us flexibility and possibility of having this continuity, that there's not a strategy that's very prescriptive and that we have to kind of dock into. So there's quite a lot of kind of trust in us defining, articulating, together with our target communities and so on, the processes for social change, and then we look into our learning, adaptation, and so on. And even if sometimes the strategies, of course, indeed have strict results frameworks and you have to report towards them, our experiences, I'm not trying to just please Sida now, but our experiences, that quite often when we encounter problems in what the results framework says, our indicators, and what we actually achieve, there's a lot of emphasis on what have you learned. So the dialogue actually also helps us to move in the direction of what you're pinpointing is important. That was my second reflection. You tell me, please, if I'm out of time. The third one, and here perhaps I'm going more particularly into one specific program. I think you're very harsh on NSP and Citizens Charter. And you know, this has been a flagship of the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. It has moved from perhaps very much on getting communities organized, getting them to use block grants for small projects, to this more kind of social contract notion in Citizens Charter, particularly, yeah, which you also describe in your report. But since you also then put so much emphasis on the benefits of public goods, public services, what Citizens Charter has started to do now is actually bring in to the whole concept of Citizens Charter the notion of minimum public services on the community level. So giving communities entitlements and letting authorities be held to account. And I think that's something that we shouldn't throw out, so to speak, with a critique of all the failures or the inadequacies of NSP and so on. Throw out the child with the bathwater, because there might be learnings and possible further adaptations and bring in more flexibility in the whole Citizens Charter concept. Maybe it's even a vehicle for moving from free from fear to free to act. I'd like to hear you reflect on that. And then the last one, I think I've already touched on it. Public goods, which I think we all agree, the service delivery has been very important, particularly within health education, for the big changes we see in positive outcomes on child mortality, maternal mortality going down, women's empowerment through education, and so on and so forth. More qualified midwives coming out of midwifery schools because they've actually managed to go through 12 years first in school, and then when they become midwives, they go to the villages to become role figures for kids growing up and the girls growing up in the village. There is a woman that's working. She has her own salary. She saves lives. She might even have an influence into the local shura next to all the men sitting there, the local community council. So changes are happening on community level, and we partially contribute to that, where power relations are changing. And I think we have to also keep that in mind. And we do that from a rights-based approach. So we have a contextualized rights-based approach. Everything we try to contextualize. So also these kind of keywords of poverty, of rights, equality, and so on are contextualized within SA, because as soon as we start discussing them, most of our colleagues are Afghan. They start twisting and turning it, looking at it from an Islamic point of view, from Afghan cultural point of view, and it becomes internalized and contextualized. But sorry, the collective goods. My point there was you through the state institutions, it's become massive scale, and you could never achieve that through NGOs, no matter how contextual and adapted and flexible we are. And I think that's an important point to take away, because we can't do away with the scale that you achieve with state.
Thank you, Andreas. I think I'm going to edit your questions a little bit and rearrange them, because I think what your overriding question is this substantialist and a relational approach are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There's room for both, and both have elements of the other, if you like. And then you gave examples of this when the way you talk about the National Solidarity Program, the NSP, and also the the provision of public goods, which maybe I'm answering for Adam now, but I think this is a way of incremental iterative kind of changing of norms. I mean, one could look at the Swedish Committee's program for disabled, for example, which I think is a very concrete way of actually helping to change norms in local communities. But Adam, would you like to say something about these? Are they mutually exclusive?
No, and I didn't write them as if they were mutually exclusive. In a sense, the surprise to me was that, in a sense, in all the writing that you see about the programming, it focuses on the substantialist agenda. It doesn't it doesn't emphasize the relational practice that actually underpins it. So I'm not saying they're exclusive. I agree you need ministries to function, you need scale and so forth, although we all know the problems of teachers who didn't turn up, ghost inventories of people and so forth. But the point I was really getting more is that actually there are things within Swedish practice, and that's why I chose you as an example, which are relational. But that is not the way they are discussed or presented or reported about. It's all reported in terms of a substantious agenda. Yet how you go about it is what is really important. And that's what needs to need a much greater focusing, I think, on the ways in which we engage. How is it possible to move from where we are now to somewhere next? But bearing in mind the broad agenda. And that would lead, in a sense, to my reflections on the strategies. I mean, I had a discussion this morning with the MFA, because, of course, they came back to me on that. You know, they had something to say. And I said, well, another way you could see it is actually simply as a statement of principles. This is what we believe in. Now CEDA should actually get on and do it. And I can see in that light. My question would then be to CEDA, well, actually, have you taken the room for manoeuvre that's been given to you by the MFA in order to develop innovative, experimental programs to explore different ways to address these issues? A challenge, I know.
Could it be that the space given and the trust and confidence in the Swedish committee given by CEDA and the government are part of a Swedish strategy, but they have not been clearly articulated in these strategy documents and so on?
I think that's absolutely the case, yes.
Yeah. So there is a different way of operating, but it has not been given.
Well, that's why I use that phrase, hidden in plain sight. You know, there are things going on that no one seems to talk about, really. And yet it's really important that they are talked about as part of Sweden's approach to engagement.
Sarah, you want to, please?
It was really interesting to listen to Andreas' point of view of how they sort of perceive the strategies in the room for maneuver. I think it's a chain, sort of, actually, or hierarchy, if you like. So I need to be careful now with how I put this, but I mean, the strategies that CEDA receives, I mean, the policy and the politics is decided by the Swedish government, obviously. So, but the strategies are also sort of, they give us the sort of room to, as Adam puts it, I think, to sort of develop how things should be done, sort of. That's left to CEDA as an agency to sort of articulate. We get the aspirations, if you like, or objectives, goals from the government, but then the sort of how is left to Sweden as an independent agency. And then we in turn then sort of give the confidence to organizations that we trust to sort of develop even further. It may be necessary to have that in more I don't know where exactly and how that should be articulated, and I'm perhaps not entirely sure why it needs to be articulated, but that's sort of the way I think that the aid architecture in Sweden maybe or sort of special in this case. I wouldn't really know. I haven't really done any comparative studies, but that's sort of how it works, basically, I would say. And I think we are fairly sort of pleased or satisfied with how that work. But I would just briefly want to comment on this sort of the relational and the trust, and that we should work more in that vein. And maybe that doesn't always marry that happily with the sort of ever-increasing demands on control of where funding goes, the anti-corruption agenda. I mean, we have zero tolerance for corruption, but I mean, with all due honesty, these two agendas aren't perhaps always that go that well together, I would say, because not being there and micromanage and sort of in detail decide what should be done and how and by whom demands that you take a step back then. And I mean, when you have a very long-term cooperation that CEDA's had with Swedish Committee, that's one thing, but it really do take a lot of time to sort of. It takes a lot of time to get there, I think. But it's, I mean, I think really the report contains valuable lessons on this and food for thought for us as an agency. Yeah. Definitely does.
And perhaps I think this is a topic that we are bound to come back to. There's other ongoing EBA work which will also look at the kinds of policies and strategies that are relevant and workable in fragile contexts in general, because there are other difficult countries, not only Afghanistan, where Sweden is engaged. So the question is, what learning is there from Afghanistan that could be applied also elsewhere? But one follow-up question to you, Andreas. Swedish committee has the experience of working under the Taliban, if you like. That was the case in the 90s, between 96 and 2001. And also during this long period, particularly over the past few years, you have worked in areas that are actually under the control of the Taliban. What is your, could you summarize that experience? How do you manage to do that? That many seem to think is not feasible.
Well, I would to start with say that I think that the Taliban of today, just like you point out, are to some extent different than from what we experienced in the 90s, but also similar in another aspect, because even during the 90s, although you had perhaps very strict edicts going out from central government, so-called government, locally you had a lot of different types of Taliban leaders, and you could negotiate. And there is a certain level of pragmatism, and there is also a certain level of responsiveness from the Taliban locally to pressure from local communities and their demands and needs. And I would say even now, the last few years, we've seen examples of that, for instance, within Citizens' Charter, where the local Taliban would object to the notion that communities should elect their community shura, the community council. And they would say, we can't have this closed ballots, we should have public hand raising. We object to women getting part of the project, of the community development, women's participation in decision making and so on. And we would actually take a step back, and the local communities would start to put pressure on them. And of course they wanted to gain the actual project as such, but they also have seen throughout the process of NSP that these are actually effective. So the Taliban would actually, in that process, have to moderate themselves. And that in itself is a development process, I think. And I think this moderation goes on all over Afghanistan. The Taliban are not very different from very rural conservative societies. And they are also getting desensitized to certain aspects of empowerment. So the Taliban, including rural elderly men or conservative, have seen that women's empowerment actually isn't that scary. Yeah. And it actually has an effect in your families, in the local community. So I think that today, of course, we don't know what the Taliban regime will become, but I think and I hope that the signs that they are now, expressing of having become moderated, I hope that we'll also see some of that put into practice, because that will also be a possibility for the local community to actually hold them to account. And I think here we also have a role in our continued, we do kind of advocacy from below. So the communities that we work with, they organize through, through midwifery associations, teachers associations, disabled people's associations, and so on. And that kind of organization actually has voice upwards towards the local Taliban, but eventually also towards the central.
Yeah, and of course this is a really interesting experience and extremely relevant and important. Adam, any further comments from your side to what Sarah and Andreas have said?
I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, I think we're looking at, obviously from slightly different angles, positions, but I don't think there's a large disagreement between us.
That I still have to add that what the Taliban is signaling now also is of course much more of segregation, and we don't know how much they will start. And I especially think for the urban communities, the change will be very substantial, especially for women in urban in cities. But again, you've had a Taliban leader actually been interviewed in TV by a female journalist, and that in itself is quite astonishing, I think. But of course, dress codes, segregation. But looking at our programming, when we see the prospect of the Taliban imposing much more segregation, our response is going to be, wow, then we have to really focus so much more on getting women educated, because if there's going to be a female teacher for every class where there are women, there's a huge deficit in the country. So we have to focus so much more on women's education and getting them to become teachers. And if it's only a female doctor that can treat female patients, then we have to churn out so many more female doctors. So the Taliban will have to be held to account for what they're stating now.
Therein lies roots to social change with those dynamics.
So things have changed in Afghanistan over these 20 years, that's clear. We may not not be fully aware exactly how that's going to be expressed, but there are clearly changes in social dynamics in this very difficult and complex country. We have invited questions. We have about 20 minutes to go. And let's see what we have. There's one question to Adam about, you talk about the imaginary about Afghanistan, the narrative, the story, the picture of what Afghanistan is. Is that something, and we've talked about to what extent can elements of trust, confidence, and so on, how can it become an element in the way a may have difficulties identifying these as strategic components? How do you see this being sort of replicated or deliberately done elsewhere?
Well, you know, policies are about, basically policies are stories. We think this is the problem, this is what needs to be done, and this is how we're going to do it, to put it in its most simplistic. And there have been lots of policy stories told about Afghanistan in a particular way. I think the key job of, you know, analysts, researchers and so forth is to tell different policy stories and to critically engage with aid donors on these and challenge them and review them. I mean, I have already in the report indicated some of the different policy stories I would tell. And I think those are the ones that we ought to more actively promote, to look at not only what the deficits and needs are, but also where the opportunities are, the logic of way things actually work, of how you can build from where you are to do something different. I mean, it won't be easy. I know, you know, donors, I look at now the way in which my own country aid agency work now absorbed into the Foreign Office, has got a very particular sort of business model of approach to aid, and it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. But I think with other more principled donors, there will be possibilities to tell different stories. And I mean, I would like to see agencies like CEDA being able to mount different stories from the general narrative based on their own programming and learning.
Do you think it does require differences in the way the bureaucracy works and functions and mechanisms that are used?
I think it is certainly challenging to
yeah.
bureaucracies for all the structural reasons that you refer to and history. I mean, institutions think in particular ways, and getting them to change their thinking is not easy.
One question I think asked by many is, so what next? We've heard Swedish ministers saying, and I will say this in Sweden, inte en spänn till Taliban, translated not a cent to the Taliban. At the same time, you have recognized and you have talked about the achievements that have been made, what is now being provided in terms of health services, education services, and so on, which are largely managed by the state. Again, it's a little bit of guesswork because we don't know what a Taliban administration is going to look like. But what do you see as sort of possible avenues to uphold and ensure that this can be sustained? Who would like to begin?
I mean, we're extremely concerned about this because it's happening here now. It's not something that we foresee into the future. I had a call, sorry I'm getting very much into current affairs right now, but we had a call just this morning with our health management staff in Kabul, saying that the World Bank has basically informed all the health actors. So health services are contracted out to NGOs. So the Ministry of Public Health takes a stewardship role and we implement all the services, NGOs. And they basically told all the NGOs that you're on your own now. There's not a single cent coming through anymore. And most of the national smaller NGOs, they have to close shop immediately because they have no margins, no reserves or whatever. So you're going to see clinics and hospitals start to close down within the next few weeks, next 2-3 months. And a few of us might have some reserves or liquidity to keep things running, but it's going to be extremely challenging for the Afghan population. And they're at a very, very critical point already. There's so much fragility right now in the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. So I'm really concerned. And I know that there's a lot of thinking going on, a lot of meetings and people putting their heads together. What would be the alternative channels to try to safeguard at least some of these public goods, public services, and not have a total state collapse. But let's assume that things are totally blocked for another 6 to 12 months. I wouldn't be surprised if the Taliban turn around to China and say, give us an emergency loan. And that's the end of Western engagement and human rights and all the aspirations we have, I think.
Yes, Sarah, this is a very political question, and this is not, SIDA is not going to make these decisions, I think, but the Swedish government will do that. But I'm sure that SIDA, you and your colleagues are thinking about this, discussing this. How do you see, what kind of potential avenues could there be to sustain what's been achieved?
Well, I mean, I'm totally share Andreas' concern here, and it's extremely challenging situation. And I mean, so I wouldn't perhaps say that no one sort of, I mean, everyone I think was sort of taken aback by the speed of how this happened. I wouldn't say that it hasn't been in the cards, though. I mean, so I've been quite closely involved with our support to the World Bank, and it's been quite a lot of sort of scenario planning going on. I think we've all been in that mode for, I mean, the last year basically, I think, or even since actually the negotiations in Doha began. But perhaps still it's still premature to sort of say how. I mean, we won't be able to fully sort of replace what's been done through the state. That's not really possible, I think. Even how many sort of NGOs or UN organization we bring in, it won't be possible. But I think there are possible, and a lot of, as Andreas say, a lot of meetings are going on, and people are thinking and not doing much else, I would say, than trying to find ways to try to solve the situation. We have to remember also that several members of the sort of Taliban are on international sanctions list, which make an organization such as the World Bank can't interact with them. And I mean, the World Bank as an organization is also, there has to be a government actually for them to interact with. And currently there is not even a government for them to work with, to countersign agreements or whatnot, even if they could, which they can't currently. But I mean, so I think what is so unfortunate is that we see sort of a humanitarian disaster unfolding in front of us, and we are a little bit tired, I would actually say, that what we can do. It's, I think, from the bottom of my heart, it's extremely frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, we all feared that with Taliban possibly coming back, they would drag the country back to the 90s. But I feel that this is the more effective one that actually will drag the country to the 90s, with the total cut off everything that has been supporting and building and developing the public institutions. And I mean, it's more than 1 million people. I don't know the exact figures, but I mean, there's so many that are actually salaried from the different national priority programs, the institutions, and then they're breadwinners. So you can multiply it by 5, 6 or whatever. And then all the services, of course, that people have benefited from. Just within education, you have about 200,000 school teachers. And I'm talking just, not higher, not the university. So about 200,000 kids, teachers, 7 million kids. So it's going to be, what NGOs run today cover perhaps 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 kids totally. Yeah. And if we scaled up, we could perhaps double over a year or two if we're lucky. But we would never manage to get to that scale. And as I said the other day, what would be the alternative for a teacher that loses his or her job? Is it to stand in a food queue because now we switch over to humanitarian aid instead? I mean, there's so many implications that I'm really concerned about. And I think while all the policy heads now put their minds together to try to see, can we find models from elsewhere in the world where we worked with other countries that have perhaps been where we don't really want to legitimize the regime or so on. I think we also have to start thinking about interim solutions, because those processes of finding alternative models and then finally perhaps agreeing with the new Taliban regime and so on, they might take another half to 1 year. And well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I'm even thinking about interim solutions, because once things fall apart, it might take time to puzzle it together again.
So it seems,
and then, sorry, to even further complicate it, and then you have, the whole kind of security dilemma as well. Of course, now one could say there's a fair stability in the country, at least in many rural areas. They would say that, the constant conflict that we had to live with daily is more or less over. And perhaps more in the cities now, they're concerned about this, attempts by ISKP to move their positions forward, and if you get the total destabilization due to state collapse for the region and the rest of the world, including millions of refugees, because I mean you have internally displaced now, a few million, and if you have then a much worsened humanitarian situation, you'd have millions starting to walk to the borders.
Because it's a triple humanitarian crisis now,
Yeah.
the displacement, the drought, and COVID.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a very challenging situation. So one question is the space that you, Adam, have talked about, and Andreas, you have described in terms of dealing with the Taliban, that there is an element of pragmatism and so on. The question is whether the international community, the UN bodies, the World Bank and governments will be able to somehow deal within this space, if that's possible, or if we will go to a regime of sanctions, which could be extremely detrimental to Afghanistan, given the small margins that we see now. Let's go to more questions from those who are watching and listening to this. There's a question to you, Adam, about gender equality. In your view, have there been any particular lessons learned or results identified on gender equality from development cooperation?
I mean, I think part of the answer comes from what Sarah said about the outcomes, the changes. And we must remember, of course, gender is both men and women. That have been improved outcomes in terms of gender equality for both young boys and young girls. Access to education, access to health, those are significant. The more difficult ones are much more in terms of economic empowerment, given the ways that markets. There are examples of programs that have achieved remarkable things, but working very much in the same way as the Swedish committee has worked. Incremental change, being able to negotiate, women being able to negotiate within the household to achieve more independence, to be able to go out to engage in highly exclusionary marketplace, and yet making progress in actually doing that. Not gender equality, but improved gender outcomes, I would say. There is evidence of that.
There's another question for you, which is about the Swedish committee. And of course, you are very positive, and you've told us about what you see have been real achievements, not least in the way of working in sort of in step with the social dynamics in Afghanistan. So the question is, to what extent do you think that the Swedish committee has practiced a human rights-based approach, or is it only practicing service delivery and trying to replace the state?
That question has already been answered.
Yes, yeah.
I'm not in a position to make judgments. I've not looked in detail at some of the actual operations, but my understanding is exactly as you have put it, that it's a contextually engaged approach. Accepting the principles.
Elaborate a bit, or if we have time, I don't know. Please. Yeah, I mean, for us, the notion that service delivery doesn't fit into a rights-based approach is flawed, at least from our context. So when we look at a rights-based approach, we look at the rights of education, right to healthcare, right to participation, right to income, and so on. And looking into rural communities where a lot of those rights cannot be achieved because there's no duty bearer to deliver them, we have engaged in service delivery. So now we engage a lot in service delivery and gap filling, where the state doesn't reach out, especially education. And when we engage with service delivery, there's immediately an opportunity to start build capacity, because the communities start to invest and defend the services, and they start to organize, and the Shura gets involved, teachers associations get involved, midwives get involved, disabled people organizations get involved. So they start to defend their services, because this is helping them out of the fear. They get free from fear. Yeah. So that in itself makes the kind of rights-based approach applicable in Afghanistan, because it's based on rights. It puts service delivery as kind of an entry point. And then you can start build capacity, build advocacy around that. Advocacy travels upwards from those experiences. And it's actually them fighting for rights. But they articulate it through their contextual vocabularies, it becomes Islamic notions of what Islam says about rights, which is perfectly compatible with their society.
So it's a gradual changing and strengthening of rights, if you like, but from below.
Where service delivery is actually a very important platform for it to happen.
Yes, exactly.
So we're a bit odd in that sense. We're a bit perhaps old-fashioned as an NGO, doing so much service delivery ourselves.
But it's about that marrying of instrumental interventions, but seeing the broader processes that they can generate and the incremental nature of that of how that happens.
So there's a lot to learn, obviously, from this way of working, and maybe it hasn't been clearly articulated. I mean, we all know about Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, schools and health services, but we know much less, I think, about this kind of gradual changing of norms and people's thinking and so on in local communities.
When I read Adam's report, lessons learned, or something that's reminded in my mind, is that we have to, of course, become better at also capturing our best practices and learnings and share and so on in dialogue. And we are right now in a process of developing a strategic plan, but we had to put it on hold due to what happened recently. And there, of course, we're trying to capture this whole theory of change in a more articulated way. Yeah. Sorry.
Two more. We have a few minutes left, and I want to give you all a minute each for any sort of final reflection that you may want to make. 2 points, perhaps. I think Sara pointed out that there has been general sort of bipartisan agreement among Swedish parties and Swedish governments generally during these long periods. There have been variations on this theme, but more or less there has been broad political support in Sweden for the way Sweden has engaged, and I think that needs to be recognized, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this debate and on what has now happened, how that's going to play out. Linked to that, there was a question to me representing the expert group for aid studies, asking me what is EBA going to recommend to the government on the basis of Adam's report. And my answer is that we don't make recommendations. Our terms of reference are not to recommend to the government, but it's to provide evidence-based analysis and conclusions that can be used by the government and government departments for shaping Swedish policy. And I think we will agree that this has been a great contribution in providing that kind of substantive analysis that is very much needed at this moment. So I'll give you a minute each if you want to begin with Adam. Any final reflections?
I think I've said enough.
Where do we go from here? What do you think is going to happen?
Well,
what's going to happen in the UK, given what we've seen?
What's going to happen in the UK? Well, I'm afraid the UK is rather... I worry even more about than I would for Sweden in terms of how the UK is going to engage now. I mean, the complete lack of a plan B, let alone a plan C, in terms of what's happened in Kabul. I've had problems enough with some of its engagement and the way in which it's moved the sort of programming content in particular directions. I think we're all going to have to recognize that the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan are going to be enormous, and we're going to have to take that on board. And that will demand a level of funding engagement, and that will involve engagement with the Taliban as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Sara?
No, but I think it's important. I mean, we need to analyze the situation and need to sort of understand what can be done, what can be sort of achieved within this totally now shifted policy environment and that we find ourselves in. We need a little bit to wait and see what will this new government look like, what can still be done in terms of sort of what kind of assistance can be brought into the country. But I think it's a little bit premature to sort of to say that much, because it's still it sounds horrible, but still early days, so to speak. So there are still a lot of unknowns. So I think we at least are a little bit cautious to. We're now sort of really engaging with our partners, the partners that we have, and see what can you do, what are you doing, are you reprogramming, what can you still do sort of under these new circumstances, and given the directions that we as a government agency have from our politicians on what we can do. So I think that's where we are at the moment. Difficult to assess the situation any further than that, actually.
Yeah. And Andreas,
yeah,
you are on the
I'll
ground.
say as Adam, I think I've spoken enough, but
you are on the ground and you will continue.
Yeah, and for the sake of the people of Afghanistan, I think we have to move one step away from just saying we don't like what happened. We have to start asking ourselves, what is it that we are expecting from further engagement into the future? What are the principles that we demand, or what are the conditions for further engagement? And get out of this just, we don't like what happened and hence we're not going to even touch it. We have to accept that there is now a de facto new power, and if we're not going to totally give up on the Afghan people, which I really sincerely hope we don't, I think we have to have some kind of dialogue related to the new regime, and be clear on our red lines and what the conditions are for continued engagement.
Thank you. So we will close this part of the seminar. Thank you so much, Andreas. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Adam. I'm sure this debate will continue, and I think you have provided a very good input for an evidence-based debate on where do we go from here. So a few final announcements from my side. We will have another seminar coming up soon, which will focus on how Swedish development cooperation is being evaluated and how development evaluations can be improved for the future. And I also mentioned that there's ongoing work on Sweden's broader engagement in fragile states, the so-called New Deal policy framework, which includes Afghanistan, by the way. And we will, I can't say the date, but there will be a report and a seminar in the relatively near future. We are also evaluating the Folket Academy, which is also very much involved in Swedish aid in Afghanistan. So these are two events that you can expect will be coming. If you want to find out what we are going to do, please look at our website, www.eba.se, and look at our newsletter that you can also have sent to you. And please look for what may be coming in our podcasts. You will also find a link to those on our website. Thank you very much, and we hope you found this an interesting seminar. Thank you.